I always thought I was the kind of person who followed the rules, until the day my family was threatened. What we did to protect them changed everything, and now, I'm left wondering if the price of justice was too high. I'll never forget the day I first set foot on the campus of Taft University. Coming from a small town like Benton, where life revolved around church trips and community events, it felt like stepping into another world. Growing up in a deeply religious household, I'd rarely ventured far from our rural community. The thought of attending a university filled with people from all walks of life was both exciting and daunting. My parents, though proud of the agricultural scholarship I'd earned, were equally anxious about the challenges and new influences that might come my way. Truthfully, I shared their apprehension. "Who was that?" Rena asked, curiosity etched on her face. We were sitting in a quiet cafe, and I was still trying to process the encounter we'd just had. I met her intense gaze, her dark hair framing her tan skin, and exhaled deeply. "That was Jasmine," I admitted softly. Rena's brows furrowed for a moment before the realization hit her. "Jasmine?" she echoed, visibly surprised. "Yeah," I said, nodding slowly. "She and I were together a long time ago. I haven't seen her in over 5 years. Running into her like that." I trailed off. "I probably owe you the whole story." Rena leaned forward, signaling she was ready to listen. Before starting at Taft, the furthest I'd ever traveled was a week-long church mission trip to Mexico. My world was small, confined to the agricultural families in and around our town, with my faith serving as a guiding principle. My parents were cautiously optimistic when I got the scholarship, but they worried about the kind of environment I'd encounter at college. When I moved into my dorm, I was paired with Charlie, a guy from Chicago. At first, he didn't seem thrilled to have a country kid as his roommate, but over time, we became good friends. Listening to my dorm mates swap stories about their wild adventures left me speechless. I'd only ever held hands or shared a shy kiss with my high school girlfriend. Their tales made me wonder if people really lived like that. The surprises didn't stop there. Boys and girls shared dorms, living on different floors, which was unheard of where I came from. One afternoon, while visiting a girl from my English class, I saw 2 girls leaving the communal showers, wrapped only in towels. They noticed me staring, giggled, and playfully teased me by adjusting their towels. I was mortified, but the incident quickly turned into a running joke among my dorm mates, who found my innocence endlessly entertaining. By junior year, I was still holding on to my virginity, torn between the values I'd grown up with and the temptations of campus life. That's when Jasmine entered my life. One Friday night, Charlie convinced me to attend a keg party. It wasn't my scene, but I went along anyway. While standing awkwardly in the crowd, a drunk guy bumped into me, spilling my beer on a passing girl. She turned toward me, annoyed, and I clumsily tried to clean the beer off her shoulder, stopping short of touching her chest. She laughed, introducing herself as Jasmine. We hit it off instantly. Jasmine was a sophomore majoring in business, living in an apartment her family owned near campus. With her blonde hair and easy smile, she exuded a confidence that was both intimidating and magnetic. By the end of the night, she asked me to walk her home. Her apartment was on the top floor of a building called Papaya, which housed a coffee shop, a bar, a pizza place, and even a phone store on the lower levels. As we climbed the stairs, she mentioned she lived alone, a detail that made me a bit nervous. When we got inside, I hesitated at the doorway, but Jasmine pulled me in. We sat on the couch, talking, and before I knew it, I leaned in and kissed her. She responded with enthusiasm, but then she pulled back, saying she'd be right back. When she returned, she wasn't wearing her clothes anymore, just a playful smile and a single strip of fabric. She joked about washing her beer-stained outfit, but it was clear her intentions were more focused. What happened next was a whirlwind, and despite everything I'd been taught, I found myself unable to resist. Before we even really began, it was over. I was mortified, but Jasmine didn't seem to mind. She handled the moment with a calm ease, cleaning up the awkwardness as if it were no big deal. That night, we had our first intimate encounter, and it marked a turning point, not just for me, but for our relationship as a whole. From then on, we were inseparable, diving headfirst into coupledom. We spent our days going out to restaurants, studying together, and doing all the little things that make a relationship feel real. One evening, I decided it was time to tell my roommates about Jasmine. When Charlie heard who she was, he immediately pulled me aside to offer some unsolicited advice. Feelings and physical stuff can get complicated, especially with your first serious girlfriend, he cautioned. I appreciated his concern, but I brushed it off. At that moment, I was too caught up in the novelty of it all to take his warning seriously. Not long after, I met Jasmine's brother, Claude, at Papaya. He was a stark contrast to Jasmine, big, imposing, and a little intimidating. He seemed to watch over the bar like a hawk, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. As I spent more time there, I started noticing how some of the customers interacted with Jasmine. They'd throw an arm around her, pat her shoulder, or hug her a little too closely for comfort. It felt off, like a violation of boundaries that should have been reserved for me as her boyfriend. When I brought it up, Jasmine simply shrugged. "That's just how it is when you work in a bar," she said casually, brushing off my concerns. Her nonchalance about something I considered deeply personal and sacred, her physical space, troubled me. I knew it was an issue we'd eventually have to discuss more seriously, but at the time, I let it slide. Another sore spot was missing the deadline to study abroad. I had dreamed of exploring new opportunities, but when I visited home, my father had a heartfelt conversation with me. He gently reminded me of the values our family held dear, hinting that if I was serious enough about Jasmine to be physically intimate with her, I should also think seriously about our future together. His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after I returned to campus. As the winter term began, I was offered a postgraduate research position at the university. It was a fantastic opportunity that would keep me rooted there for the foreseeable future. Around the same time, I realized just how much Jasmine meant to me, and the idea of marrying her began to take hold. After much thought, I decided to propose. I expected life to feel different after we got married, but in many ways, it didn't, at least not right away. I encouraged Jasmine to re-enroll in school, even though she wasn't thrilled about it. I also tried to introduce small changes to our lifestyle, like studying more, drinking less, and even attending church with me. At first, she went along with my suggestions, teasing me by calling me Dad. But over time, my well-meaning reminders started to feel like nagging, both to her and to me. One thing that consistently bothered me was the time she spent at Papaya. The bar's wild atmosphere clashed with the life I envisioned for us, and I began to resent how much of her energy it consumed, whether she was working there or just hanging out. One night, Jasmine didn't answer my calls. When I finally got through to her the next morning, her voice sounded groggy, like she was recovering from a long night of drinking. Frustration welled up inside me. I had started imagining a stable future for us, but it felt like we were stuck in a loop, with her priorities and mine pulling us in different directions. When I got home, the tension was palpable. Neither of us could seem to shake the bad mood that lingered between us. I tried to mend things, bringing Jasmine small gifts, being extra attentive, and doing everything I could to make her happy. But despite my efforts, something still felt off. It became clearer over time, Jasmine seemed bored with our marriage. I couldn't stop thinking about it during my next trip to the farm. Determined to fix things, I came up with a plan, a second honeymoon in Cancun. I thought a romantic getaway might rekindle the spark we had lost. When I shared the idea with Jasmine, her reaction was lukewarm. She thanked me, patted my back with a forced smile, and said, "Just making sure my sister was okay." Her lack of enthusiasm stung. Things took a turn for the worse when I learned about Jerome. One evening, I walked in to find her laughing while perched on Jerome's lap. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. Her brother Claude, who had always seemed overprotective, caught my eye with a knowing look. "Just making sure my sister's okay," he said, patting my back in a way that felt more like a warning than reassurance. That night, as Jasmine and I climbed the stairs, my mind raced. Images of her laughing on Jerome's lap and the ominous presence of Claude played on repeat in my head. When I brought up the incident, she brushed it off, insisting that Jerome was just a friend. But to me, her behavior felt wildly inappropriate for a married woman. For weeks, tension filled the air between us. The more we argued, the more I began questioning the foundation of our marriage. Had I been blind to cracks all along? I confided in Paul, a trusted friend, and explained the situation. He suggested installing wireless cameras in the apartment while I was away to get to the bottom of things. Together, we coordinated Jasmine's schedule and planned to set up the cameras on a Thursday when she wouldn't be home. Paul and I placed one camera in the living room, one in the bathroom, and one in the bedroom. He assured me they would only activate in detecting movement and promised to start recording the next time I went to the farm. As I prepared to leave, I tried to act normal around Jasmine, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I knew I couldn't keep up the charade for much longer. The following Monday, I met Paul at a coffee shop. His face was unreadable as he slid a folder across the table toward me. "Owen, it's not good," he said softly. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were photos and videos, clear evidence of Jasmine's infidelity. The images showed her and Jerome in intimate, compromising positions in our apartment. It was undeniable. A wave of anger, sadness, and self-loathing crashed over me. I had tried so hard to save our marriage, only to learn it had been unraveling behind my back. Avoiding confrontation with Jasmine, I spent the next day preparing for my next chapter. I met with Tim to finalize details about an overseas assignment that would take me far from the mess of my personal life. I learned I'd first fly to Los Angeles, then to Jakarta, and finally to a rural village where the project was based. Tim handed me a packet with everything I'd need, including vaccination schedules and travel plans. Suddenly, everything was in motion. I packed my belongings and spent one last night in the apartment. The reality of leaving my marriage behind was bittersweet, but I knew it was my only option. As I was loading my car the next morning, Claude appeared out of nowhere, his face twisted with rage. He confronted me, and before I could react, he shoved me to the ground and began striking me in a blind fury. I managed to shout for help, and two passers-by rushed to intervene. Their arrival startled Claude, and he fled the scene. Shaken and bruised, I leaned on the bystanders for support until I could get to my car. Once I was safely on the road, a mix of relief and fear washed over me. I had escaped the chaos, but I knew staying in the city was no longer an option. My life as I had known it was over, and as painful as that realization was, I knew I had to move forward, starting with the journey to a new place and, hopefully, a new beginning. It was time to start over. A few days later, I found myself at the airport, waiting for my flight to Indonesia. My lawyer had emailed me earlier, confirming that Jasmine had been served with the divorce papers. The weight of my decision hung over me, but so did a sense of relief. I was finally leaving behind the chaos that had consumed my life. Indonesia was a fresh start, but it came with its own challenges. I had grown close to Rina, a kind and thoughtful colleague whose quiet strength had captivated me. One evening, I asked her brother, Nephi, if it would be okay for me to take her out to dinner, just the two of us. He sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he considered my request. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I like you, Owen, but I have to protect my family." Then, as if to explain his hesitation, he shared the tragic story of how Rina's parents had been killed by rebels nearly a decade ago. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable, and his protectiveness suddenly made perfect sense. "I would never hurt Rina," I assured him. He studied me for what felt like an eternity before finally clasping my arm. I believe you, he said simply. Over the next few weeks, Rena and I grew closer, though I was careful to respect her family's boundaries and the pace of our relationship. While we hadn't become physically involved, the attraction between us was undeniable. As our bond deepened, I began to think about marriage. I wanted Rena to meet my family, so we planned a trip to the United States. During our visit, her warmth and sincerity quickly won over my parents. We also took a detour to my old university, where my former advisor, Tim, suggested I pursue a master's degree while continuing my research. Before we flew back to Indonesia, Rena confided in me about her concerns for the future. She worried about being far from her family, especially if we were to settle in the U.S. I reassured her, saying, "No matter where we live, there will always be a place for you." Her worried expression softened, and she smiled, her relief palpable. When our wedding day came, my family made the long journey to Indonesia to celebrate with us. The ceremony was simple yet filled with joy, and I was glad my family had the chance to bond with Rena's. At one point during the reception, my dad pulled me aside. "You picked the right one this time," he said with a proud smile. With the money I had saved over my years in Indonesia, Rena and I were able to buy a house near Taft University. When we eventually moved to the U.S., Rena found work at the campus health clinic and began taking the remaining classes she needed to become a registered nurse. We settled into our new life quickly, though Rena missed her family deeply in those early months. One Saturday evening, while we were out at a restaurant, I heard a voice behind me that froze me in my tracks. I turned to see Jasmine. Elsewhere, the encounter weighed heavily on Jasmine. Furious and feeling betrayed, she vented to Claude later that week. "There he was, acting like he's better than me, with that girl," she said bitterly. Claude drummed his fingers on the table, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly," he said finally, "I think you're better off without Owen." "Who was she?" Jasmine asked, her voice rising in frustration. "I don't know," Claude replied calmly. "What did she look like?" Jasmine described me and Rena as best as she could, her tone sharp with irritation. "I think her name was Rita or something," she added dismissively. Claude leaned back in his chair, letting Jasmine's anger wash over him. Deep down, he believed she needed to move on, but he couldn't shake the sense that their paths were still entangled in ways neither of them fully understood. I recognized him instantly, Claude. His towering frame and familiar sneer gave him away. Later, I learned that Claude had bragged to Jasmine about intimidating Rena, clearly proud of himself. Jasmine, unimpressed, urged him to go further. "Make it count this time," she said coldly, "and I want to be there to see it." Claude grinned, already plotting his next move. That Saturday, Rena and I headed to the park for a tennis game. It was a sunny, breezy day, and the match had been light-hearted and fun. But midway through, I noticed Jasmine and Claude lingering nearby. Their presence felt heavy, deliberate. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on Rena's laughter and the rhythm of our game. Then Claude approached. This wasn't going to be friendly. As he drew closer, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since our last confrontation. Over the years, I had gained 30 pounds of muscle and learned to defend myself thanks to vigorous training and the guidance of a few skilled instructors. Claude, on the other hand, had let himself go, his bulk now concentrated in his gut. I raised my hands instinctively, adopting a defensive stance. "Want to try again?" I challenged, my voice steady. Claude smirked, clearly relying on brute strength as he charged at me. But this time, I was ready. I sidestepped quickly, pushing him off balance and sending him stumbling. The shock on his face was satisfying. "Surprised, huh?" I taunted. "I'm not the same guy you pushed around years ago." Claude growled and came at me again, but I ducked low and delivered a powerful sidekick to his side. He gasped, his confidence crumbling as he staggered backward. Jasmine, watching from the sidelines, didn't rush to his aid. For once, she seemed speechless. Later that evening, we picked up Nephi from the airport. She had finally made the move to join us in the US and was brimming with excitement, though I could see the overwhelm in her eyes as we drove through the bustling city. When we arrived home, Rena showed her the guest room we had lovingly prepared. Nephi's eyes filled with tears as she asked softly, "Is this really mine?" Rena smiled warmly and nodded. "It's all yours." Over the next week, we helped Nephi settle in and adjust to her new surroundings before her summer classes started. She adapted quickly, though we did have to break her of her newfound obsession with American daytime TV. One lingering concern nagged at me: Nephi's beauty and innocence could easily draw the wrong kind of attention. But Rena reassured me. "She's smart and strong," she said. "We'll guide her." That summer passed peacefully. Nephi seemed to be thriving, balancing her studies and making new friends. We even took a trip to Benton to visit my family, where Nephi charmed everyone with her humor and genuine warmth. One day, Rena casually mentioned that Nephi was out having dinner with friends. "Is this a date?" I asked, half joking. Rena shrugged with a smile. "Maybe. She's making friends. At some point, she'll have a boyfriend, and it'll be fine." She was right, of course. Still, I kept a watchful eye. Occasionally, I'd spot Nephi at the coffee shop with a small group, but she didn't mention much about her social life. Eventually, Nephi started spending more time with Dennis, a classmate she had befriended. They didn't stay over at each other's places, but she sometimes got home late. Seeing how comfortable and happy she seemed, I began to relax. Perhaps, I thought, things were finally falling into place. I hadn't needed to worry about Dennis after all. Meanwhile, Claude was scheming again. One day, a Papaya employee excitedly told him he'd seen Rena at the coffee shop with Dennis. Suspicious, Claude asked Armin, one of his more reliable contacts, to keep tabs on Dennis. As fall wore on, the tension in the air grew thick, though I wasn't aware of just how deeply Claude's suspicions were beginning to fester. One evening, Nephi had plans to meet Dennis at the coffee shop. A large American man held the door open for her as she arrived. "Thank you," she said with a warm smile. Inside, Dennis was waiting, seated near the window. Later that night, Rena grew worried when Nephi didn't answer her calls. "I haven't heard from her or Dennis," she said, concern creeping into her voice. By midnight, there was still no word. I suggested we wait another hour, but when 1 a.m. came and went, I couldn't sit still anymore. I decided to check Dennis's apartment. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. His place looked dark and empty. Frustrated, I drove around town, searching for any sign of his car, but it was nowhere to be found. By 2 a.m., I was parked outside Papaya, anger simmering beneath the surface. I clenched my phone, dialing Dennis's number. When he finally picked up, his voice was groggy and disoriented. "Who is this?" he asked, sounding confused. "It's Owen," I shouted. "Where's Nephi? What happened last night?" Dennis stammered, clearly dazed. We arranged to meet at his apartment, and when he showed up, he looked awful, tired, disheveled, and pale. He seemed almost as dazed as Nephi had been the last time I'd seen her. I had no sympathy for him. He had put Nephi in danger, and I needed answers. Dennis explained that he and Nephi had met at the coffee shop as planned. Then, Claude had shown up unexpectedly and invited them both for a drink at Papaya. That's when everything began to unravel. Nephi and Rena ended up at the hospital that night. I stayed home, waiting anxiously for updates. The police took Nephi's statement, but without DNA evidence or clear memories of the night, their investigation hit a dead end. The aftermath weighed heavily on all of us. One evening, I overheard Rena speaking with her family in Indonesia. She told me that Bakti and Vile, close relatives, were flying in to support Nephi and that they were planning to take her home to Indonesia for her safety and healing. That news hit me hard. I could feel my emotions boiling over, and without saying a word to Rena, I grabbed my keys and drove straight to Papaya. When I entered the bar, my determination was unshakable. The chaotic music and dim lighting did nothing to deter me as I strode toward Claude's office. I knew this confrontation was inevitable, and I welcomed it. Claude looked up as I entered, his expression smug and unbothered. "Owen," he said softly, his tone almost mockingly calm. "Why aren't these men in jail?" I tried to explain the justice system to Bhakti, how evidence was required, and how the principle of innocent until proven guilty could sometimes leave victims without the justice they deserved. But even as I spoke, I struggled to make sense of it myself. Bhakti listened quietly, his head bowed, hands clasped behind his back. He absorbed every word, his expression unreadable. Finally, after a long pause, he asked, "So the police can't help?" I shook my head. He sighed deeply, then spoke again, his tone calm but resolute. "These men must pay." I nodded in agreement, and we walked in silence for a while, the weight of what we were planning hanging heavily between us. The plan began to take shape with Dennis playing a key role. He continued his interactions with Claude, feeding him carefully crafted lies. One evening, Dennis told us how Claude's interest in Nephi had escalated. He even hinted at wanting to see her again, Dennis said, forcing a smile. Claude bought every word. Convinced that Nephi was eager to see him, he let his guard down. That's when we moved to the next phase. Rena and Vale helped craft flirtatious texts supposedly from Nephi, using photos of Rena and Nephi to make it convincing. The fake messages stoked Claude's ego, drawing him deeper into the trap. On the morning of their planned arrival at the Fuzzy House, a rundown property we had transformed into a carefully set trap, Rena took on the role of bait. She would pose as Nephi, pretending to be interested in Claude. It was the part of the plan that made me the most anxious. Bhakti noticed my unease. He pressed his forehead gently against mine, a gesture of solidarity. "Owen, trust the plan," he said firmly. "No one from our family will be hurt." Rena played her role perfectly. Dressed to appear vulnerable and alluring, she kept Claude and the others distracted, making them believe she was Nephi from a distance. When the men arrived, it didn't take long for the plan to unfold. They were subdued swiftly and tied up. As we prepared to move them, Bhakti removed their gags briefly to demand answers. "Why did you hurt Nephi?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with fury. Claude, ever defiant, smirked and replied, "She wanted it. She was begging for more." The words sent a wave of anger through all of us. Bhakti, his jaw clenched, ordered their gags to be replaced immediately. We transported them in a van, bound and gagged, to a remote harbor where Bhakti had arranged for a boat through a cousin. The vessel reeked of diesel and fish as we crossed the water to an isolated island. As we neared the shore, we removed their gags. Jasmine, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned to me, pleading desperately. Her voice cracked as she begged for mercy, but I kept my eyes fixed ahead, ignoring her completely. Once on the island, we loaded them onto a truck that disappeared into the dense jungle. Their fate was no longer in my hands, and I didn't ask for details. When we returned home a week later, life seemed to pick up where it had left off. Rena and I focused on restoring a sense of normalcy, avoiding any mention of what had transpired. But the weight of what we'd done lingered in my mind. I couldn't help but think about the choices we had made, the lengths we had gone to protect our family. Right or wrong, it was a part of me now, etched into my memory as a reminder of just how far we had been willing to go for justice. When I was alone, I often questioned whether we had made the right choice. I wasn't entirely sure, but one thing was clear, I didn't feel guilty. The weight of those decisions didn't haunt me, instead, they felt like necessary steps to protect the people I loved. Nephi returned to America shortly after. We reassured her that any threats were gone, though we spared her the details. She seemed relieved, saying how much she liked America and how she wanted to stay for good. The night before her flight, I went for a walk while Rena prepared Nephi's room. My thoughts wandered, but I found a strange sense of peace knowing Nephi was safe and beginning to heal. Back in the U.S., life gradually returned to normal. Rena continued her work at the campus clinic, finding fulfillment in helping others. Nephi bounced back remarkably well, though there were moments when her trauma resurfaced. During those times, we reminded her she was safe and surrounded by love. As for Claude, Jasmine, and Armin, we hadn't heard anything about them since that day. Someone mentioned that Papaya had closed, which only raised more questions. But I knew better than to dig too deeply. Some answers were best left undiscovered. Meanwhile, Jasmine's journey had taken a dark turn. Exhausted and desperate, she sought shelter on the remote island where we had left them. In her haste, she ignored her surroundings and lay down in a secluded spot, failing to check for dangers. She awoke to a foul smell, only to find herself face to face with a Komodo dragon. Back home, life moved forward. Nephi had recovered well, finding her stride once more. Dennis had remained a loyal friend but had moved on from their brief relationship. Even Bhakti had joined us in America, bringing his warmth and charm to a local restaurant where he now worked as the maitre d' at Typhoon. Sometimes, I would find myself reflecting on everything we had done. Was it the right thing? I couldn't say for certain. But I never felt guilt. My family was happy, and that mattered more than anything else. On a sunny afternoon, as I walked out of a manicurist's shop, a rare indulgence for myself, I couldn't help but smile. My hands, both literally and metaphorically, were clean.